1. October 16th, 2014. I was a little boy when this happened. My house was built over 75 years ago, so it is old. People who lived in that house before us had died in that house. I think the original owners were named JD something. Why? Well, in our basement. I think it's a name, but I'm not sure. It says JD in spray paint. I never thought much of it until this night. My dad's room is right beside mine. And on the other side of my room is a bathroom and a hallway. I always hear strange sounds such as whispers and loud steps going across the ground, but I never thought much of it. So one night I got up to use the bathroom and I left the door open. And when I left it open, I could see all down the hallway. As I looked over the hallway, I saw a black smudge go across. At this point I was very paranoid, so I finished up in the bathroom and turned to look. And what I saw was unforgettable. I saw a dark, fuzzy-looking man with a disfigured face. I screamed so loud I woke my dad up and got a hold of his revolver, and my dad found me and told me to go into my room. I felt much better. He had been SWAT and a police instructor for almost 30 years. I grabbed a knife that I kept on my nightstand and opened it, and as I did I heard a loud gunshot. My dad had shot the wall. He also saw the person or demon or whatever it was, and we called 911 and had the police search the house, and me and my dad stayed awake all night. Since then we fixed the gunshot hole and never heard anything more. 2. In this story I was about 4 or 5. One day I had walked outside to play in my pool with my friend. As we did this, my dad said he was going to Home Depot, and my mom was inside if we needed her. After about an hour, I saw someone on my second-story deck. I mentioned it to my friend, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh, it must be your dad." My deck was around 50 to 70 feet from my pool, so I couldn't make out clearly who or what it was. My mom came out while the figure was still in view. I asked if Dad was back, and she said that he had called her telling her he would be another hour. On top of that, his truck never came back. All three of us looked back at the deck, seeing nothing. After this, me and my friend retired to my room, and we played on my Nintendo 64. My dad came back around 30 minutes after this, and we told him what happened. He theorized that we may have built our house on a Native American burial ground. Half as a joke, half serious, since the area in Texas we lived in was known Comanche territory back in the day. Later that night we went to bed, but I was awakened by a sharp kick that resonated through my head as if someone had purposefully kicked it from underneath. I checked if my friend had done it, but to my dismay he was still in bed. I never told anyone about this until I discovered a few arrowheads on our property about 2 years after the incident. Turns out my mom had felt the jolt lots when she slept downstairs, in the spare bedroom. Nothing else came of the situation until a week before we moved out. I heard scratching coming from an access panel that led to the area under our house, which can only be described as a basement with a dirt floor. Needless to say, I ran upstairs and told my parents, who, bravely, at the time, opened the hatch and told whoever it was to shoo, thinking it was a raccoon or something of a furry nature. Once again that night I felt the jolt through my head. I really don't know if all this was just a child's imagination or a vivid dream, but my mom experienced it as well, making it all the more eerie. To top it all off, cut to 15 years later, me and my dad revisited the old house, which was back on the market. I asked the seller if they found it peaceful out where it was. They said yes, but I swear there is some ghost or something in this house. Every Sunday morning for the past month, a glass falls in the kitchen, at 9 a.m. exactly. You know anything about that? My dad and I just stared at each other, and more or less ran the hell out of there, not turning back. 3. So because of, well, life, I got my license at 22 rather than 17, like most kids in my state. But I didn't mind. I was just happy to be able to drive. The first thing I did when I got my license was start driving everywhere, just to learn the ropes. I drove to places my parents would never bother to go, let alone take me. And oftentimes, I would get lost on purpose, and then let my GPS bring me home. Once I get used to daytime driving, I switched to nights. And it was one of my late night drives in particular that is of note. So I was in a town where my dad had grown up about 20 minutes from, where he and myself lived at the time. I would also like to point out that by late night, I meant about 2 in the morning, so there was almost no one on the roads in the town that goes to bed by 9. While on a road that ran along the length of a small brook, I came to a T-shaped intersection, where I had the right of way, but in the intersection, on the other road, was what looked like from a distance, in the dark, to be a 1970s Mustang or similar classic car. As it pulled up to the stop sign, it had its blinker on to pull out in the same direction as me. As I did not want to be tailgated by a potential asshole, I slowed right the fuck down to a near crawl, hoping it would pull out in front of me. Now here's the part where I'd say he waited, pulled out behind me, and tailed me for hours, but nope. Instead, my view of the car passes behind a large oak tree, and as I pass the tree, the car is gone. Just fucking no longer there. It was behind the tree for maybe 2 seconds at most. So me being no stranger to freaky shit like this, I'm overcome with joy that I saw something cool that night, rather than being scared. But then my skeptic brain kicks in, and I decide to see if maybe it pulled into a driveway or something. So I turn around and search the area. Nothing. No driveways, no cars in a ditch, nothing. It was about this time that my phone rings, so being a safe driver, I pull off to the side of the road and answer it. It's my dad wondering where the fuck I was, why I was driving at 2:30 in the morning. After I calm him down and say I'll be home by 3, I proceed to tell him what happened. My dad, being the kind of guy that must actually see a ghost for himself before he believes they exist, simply says that although he believes me, he doesn't find it nearly as cool as me, and repeats that I should get home soon. So I head home, and nothing else happened. 4. So I live in a small community called Skeleton, in Cairns, Nova Scotia province. I am 13 now, but at the time this takes place, I would say I was around 9 to 10 years old. Nothing much really happens here, but this did scare me enough for me to share it, so around 2012, I would be downstairs watching TV, and shows I'm way too young for, like Family Guy. I looked out my window in my living room, once, and saw what I thought was a black coat hung up, but I'm not sure anymore. At the time, I ignored it. In the night 2 months later, it was there again, and this time, I saw it move, so I thought someone was watching. So I slept down somewhere else, closed my blinds of course. My dad would open them when I'm sleeping, and when I walked to elementary school, the house blinds would always be closed. The one night, I also saw nothing there, and the next moment, saw someone dressed all in black. I could not see the face, looking into my house. I again sat out of view. In June 2012, I went up to visit family in Grand Pierre, located in the Alberta province. And nothing happened up there, of course. When I went back to Stellarton in around May 2013, I saw it again, and I got a look at its face, and I swear, I saw him smile. I pretty much shit a brick, and ran off the room until I got the courage to go back. It was again just him wearing black. He hid his face again, The next morning when I went to school, the blinds were closed, but I still ran to school as fast as I could. It has been 3 years since whoever lived there moved out, and nothing happened since, and I have since gotten over this experience, but I still wonder, what if he ever entered my house? 5. My story starts when I'm about 9 or 10. My parents had divorced a few years before, and my dad had stayed in our house since my mother left him. She packed up the car and put me and my sister in the back, and we drove away, across the river to a new house. We didn't really understand what was happening, but anyway, that isn't really part of the story. My dad stayed in our small 3-bedroom house, and before he remarried years later, he had 2 different roommates. One was a pretty nice guy that went to his church. We would see him a little bit when we were visiting our dad. But after this roommate got married, he got another roommate, a friend of his from high school. We'll call him MJ. He seemed nice, and I had seen him a few times before when our dad had visited him, taking me and my sister with him. When we would visit our dad, MJ was really nice to us. When I would get out of the bath, he would offer to brush my hair for me. When I was that age, I had very long and curly hair that tangled very easily, so one of my parents would always brush my hair for me to make sure it was done thoroughly. It always made me uncomfortable when he would tell me to come and sit with him so he could brush my hair. So after he had done it 2 or 3 times, I stopped going into the living room after my baths and waited in my room for my dad to be done helping my younger sister get ready for bed, so that he could brush it for me. I was too young to realize that there could be anything wrong with MJ offering to brush my hair, and I didn't really understand why I didn't like it, so I didn't tell anyone. A few months later, we were visiting our dad and someone came over to the house to get his help for the car. My dad is a mechanic. There was a park 2 doors down from our house, and since our dad was busy, MJ offered to take us to the park. We were really excited, since we weren't allowed to go to the park by ourselves. After my dad got done helping his friend with their car, he walked down to the park to get us, telling us that he needed to go to the store. MJ offered to go with us, and offered to drive us, since he had a station wagon. He knew we liked the station wagon because it had one of those super cool seats in the back that faced out of the back window. Well, I should say super cool to us little kids. At the store, we begged our dad to look at the toys, and since he was shopping in a different part of the store, MJ offered to go with us to the toy section. In the toy section, I headed straight to the Barbie aisle. I absolutely loved Barbies as a kid. I had over 25 Barbies, 2 Barbie houses, a Barbie car, just about everything. There was this one Barbie that I had wanted for a long time, and they had it there at the store, so I basically stayed there and looked at it the entire time. I'll never forget that MJ came up behind me in the aisle and started asking me questions about the Barbie and how much I liked the Barbie and stuff like that. Then he was quiet for what seemed like a long time, but was probably more like 30 seconds. But then he got up really close to me and whispered, "I'll make a deal with you." I looked up at him and asked, "What kind of deal?" He smiled and whispered again, "I'll buy the Barbie for you tomorrow, but you have to do something for me." I was excited by the thought of finally getting this Barbie, so I asked him, "What?" He whispered again, saying, "Tonight, after everyone is asleep, even your dad, I want you to come see me in my room." I definitely know that I thought that was weird because I asked, "Why?" He answered softly, "Just to talk. I get lonely. And we can talk about school. I just want to help you and get to know you." I know that warning bells should have been blaring in my head at this point, but It was only a slightly uneasy feeling, but I said, "Okay." After I agreed, he made sure to tell me that I couldn't tell anyone, not even my dad or my younger sister, that it was our secret. I couldn't think of anything else after that. But I was going to get my Barbie tomorrow. When I went to bed that night, it was on my mind, so at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I lay in bed and listened for sounds that Dad might still be up. I didn't hear anything, so I crept down the hall to peek into the living room and kitchen. Everything was dark, so he was asleep. So I tiptoed back down the hall to MJ's closed door. I knocked really softly, and he opened the door and let me in, closing the door behind him. Then he went and got back in his bed. By now I was feeling pretty uneasy, so I stood next to the bed but not within reach and asked him, "What do you want to talk about?" He told me to sit down and patted the spot in front of him on the bed, but I told him I was okay and remained standing. Then he asked me a few questions about school and my friends, and told me to sit down with the same gesture of patting the bed. I brushed him off and remained standing. He asked a couple more questions, and again requested I come sit on the bed next to him, but this time saying, "I'm sure you're tired. You shouldn't just stand there. You might get sick or have an asthma attack from the night air." Side note, I've had severe asthma my entire life, and until I was about 15. It was above and beyond severe. I had to be careful about what I did and whose houses I went to in order to avoid triggering an attack. I finally relented. Like I said, I was a naive young kid. After I had been sitting on the side of his bed for a minute or two, he told me to lay down and rest, again expressing concern about my asthma. And like an idiot kid, I did it. I mean, come on. This was the 80s. I was raised in the South. You did what an adult told you to. Well, as soon as I laid down, the touching started. At first he was just rubbing me and talking to me, but then he tried to touch an even more intimate area. And that is finally when my alarm bells went off. I slid off the bed and tried to sound as nonchalant as I could when I told him, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed now." And I fled from his room as fast as I could. Needless to say, I didn't get my Barbie, but I also didn't tell anyone about what had happened. After that, every time I went to my dad's house for the weekend, he would find some way to have some time alone with me, and ask me to come to his room that night, each time promising that if I did, he would get me the Barbie. Each time I didn't go on purpose. The next day, he would say, "You didn't come to my room. I was hoping to see you." And I would make an excuse saying that I had fallen asleep. My sister and I always woke up early, before our dad, and many, many mornings I would be jolted awake to find MJ standing by my bed, staring at me. I would ask him if he needed something, and every time he would tell me that he thought he heard me wheezing, and thought I might have been having an asthma attack. The weird thing I didn't realize about MJ, that I found out years and years later, was that when my sister and I would go with my dad to visit him, before he became his roommate, we were visiting him in prison. I remember asking my dad if it was a school, like a boarding school for rich people, because I didn't really understand the concept of prison yet. It never even crossed my mind. I also found out that the reason he was in prison was for stalking a woman. He was so obsessed with her, and when she told him she wasn't interested, he flew into a rage and went to her house with a gun and just started firing into the house. Her 2 very small children were in there too. Luckily, no one was hurt, but he went away for a few years because of it. Well, Eventually, my horrifying experience finally came out. My mom started suspecting something was going on. She told me later that my behavior changed, and that I started always packing pajamas when I went to my dad's house, when usually I would just sleep in a nightgown or an oversized t-shirt. She confronted me about it, and I told her. It was horrifying and humiliating. The next morning, my mom drove me into town to my grandparents' house and called my dad and grandfather at work and told them to come to the house right then. She made this huge dramatic scene about it, and I'll never forget that for a second, my dad didn't say anything, and I noticed that his hands were balled up into fists. He lifted them both up and slammed them down on the arms of my grandmother's rocking chair, and one of the arms broke off right then. "I'll kill him! I'll kill him!" he screamed over and over. Then he just walked out, slamming the door behind him and tearing off down the street in his truck. It was scary. I had never seen my dad scream like that, and had never seen him so angry. A few years later, my mom told me that my dad had driven straight to MJ's work and beat the ever-living shit out of him. One of his co-workers called the police, but MJ refused to press charges against my dad. My mother also told me that when his boss heard what my dad was screaming at him about, what he was accusing him of, he fired him. Next, I'm told my dad went straight from there back home and emptied every bit of MJ's things out of his house, and whatever he could, he broke in the process. My parents sat me down a few days later and talked to me about what happened, and asked me if I wanted to press charges against him. I didn't know what that meant, so they had to explain it to me, and when they did, I couldn't think anything about how embarrassing it would be to do that, so I said no. It was a long time before I would see MJ again. This is where the stalking part of the story begins. Fast forward half a dozen years or so, and I'm 16. My dad got me my first car, an old Dodge Charger, that he paid nearly nothing for and fixed up for me. The thing about this car is it was metallic gold, and there was just no other car like it in our town. It was very distinguishable, and everyone knew it was my car. My family owns 3 major businesses in our town, and everyone knew my dad, uncles, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Nearly everyone in town knew me, or at least knew who my family was. Sadly, this car never ran too well. It would only give me a couple of good months before it broke down for some reason or another. One day I was babysitting a couple of my younger half-siblings, and a little boy that I tended regularly, and I decided to take them to see a movie because it was too hot to play outside that day. On the way back from the movie, my car breaks down. I wasn't too far from my dad's shop, so I wasn't too worried about it. I knew a place fairly close that we could walk to, and I could use a phone to call him. This was the early 90s, so before cell phones were very popular. All I had was a beeper. We all got out of the car and we were preparing to walk to the little store from which I could call my dad when a van stops, obviously to see if I need assistance. It's the South. People are friendly. When the driver gets out of the van and starts walking towards us, it takes me a moment to realize it's MJ. When that hit me, my heart leaped and started beating really hard. I was instantly terrified and felt so nauseated, I thought I was going to throw up. He walked up and asked, "Do you need any help?" And I could tell that he didn't recognize me at first. I couldn't see anything for a second. I was in panic overload. But I finally found my voice and stammered, "No, thanks, I'll just call my dad, he's a mechanic." He squinted his eyes like he was confused. "Do you want me to take a look?" He stepped towards me and I took a step back. He stopped and his face froze. He recognized me. Panic flooded through my entire body. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. These 3 little kids were my responsibility. Next, he said, "Can I go get some help for you?" I think he was trying not to freak me out. And I was trying to be reasonable, so I replied, "Yes, please, my dad owns a shop right up the road. It's on Market Street. Ask for my dad's name. Just tell him I'm here and to please come get me." But I knew I didn't have to tell him any of that. He knew where my dad's shop was. He knew his name. I just had to pretend I didn't know him, didn't recognize him, for my own sanity. He got back in his van, drove past us to the light, and turned right toward my dad's shop. I was terrified that he would come back, but he didn't. My dad raced to get us as fast as he could. A few months later, I was at work. I had been working part-time at Sears in the children's clothing department for about 6 months or so. And guess who walks in? Yep, you guessed it. MJ walked in with a woman, obviously his girlfriend by their body language. There were 2 little girls with them, and the girlfriend was obviously pregnant. They headed towards the infant section, which was usually where I worked because I had the best knowledge of all the car seats, strollers, cribs, and things because of all the kids running around my house. I knew a lot about babies. I ducked behind clothing racks and ran to the boys section and asked my co-worker to switch areas with me for a little bit, so hopefully MJ wouldn't see me. I seriously hid behind the video game counter, feeling absolutely sick to my stomach, sweating profusely, my heart beating so hard I thought it was going to come through my chest. After a few minutes, I checked to see if they had left. They were still there, and my appearance caused a different customer to call me, asking for assistance. I had to leave the sanctuary of the video game counter. I kept an eye on MJ and company, hoping that he wouldn't notice me while I was so exposed helping the customer. They paid for their selections and started heading out of the store past where I was. I turned my back, but had to turn around to answer a question. And when I did, his eyes locked on mine. I tried to keep recognition off of my face and look away quickly, but not before he gave me a discreet little wave, as if to say, "Yes, I recognize you, and I know where you work." To say the least, he creeped me the hell out, but I was relieved when I saw them walk out of the store. A few weeks later, I'm leaving work, driving through a neighborhood on my way to my boyfriend's apartment, which isn't very far away. I look up into my rearview mirror and see a van behind me. It looks familiar. Suddenly, I realize it's his van, and I feel sick. I am definitely freaking out and not sure what to do. I turn a few times, and he stays behind me, and I'm positive he's following me on purpose. I decide my best bet is to keep going to my boyfriend's apartment and run up to his door, even if I leave my car just out in the middle of the parking lot. My boyfriend at the time lived in a busy, full college apartment complex. There was always multiple people out doing different things. I think that spooked him because even though he followed me into the complex, he didn't follow me all the way to the building I was going to. My boyfriend went out and looked around after I told him what was going on, but he didn't see MJ, thankfully, in another couple of weeks. I come out of work at the mall to find a creepy note under my windshield wiper. I go back into the building and cry. After I've calmed down, I ask a friend that works in the tool department to walk me out to my car and follow me home. A few days later, I'm driving around town, running errands and delivering parts for my dad. And I look up in my rearview mirror, and his van is there again. He's following me again. I had finally broken down and told my dad what had been happening, and he told me to tell him if it ever happened again. So that day, when I went back to the shop, I tell my dad. He tells me not to worry about it, he'll take care of it. I don't see MJ again for almost a year. My dad asked around, found out where he worked, went and confronted him, and freaked him out pretty good, I think. During that time, my dad got me a different car and sold my gold Charger. At least he wouldn't be able to spot me based on that. The new-to-me car was super common, in fact. One of my closest friends had one exactly like it. Same color, even. I eventually quit working at Sears after I was offered a courier job at a travel agency. It was better pay and a lot more fun. One of my responsibilities was shopping for the office supplies for both office locations. One day I'm in Office Max, or some store like that, shopping for supplies. I'm waiting in line to pay when MJ just walks in. I didn't see him at first, but I recognized his voice as he passed me. I jerked my head in his direction as soon as I heard it. And there he was. He stopped and looked at me. He smiled. "How are you, Becky?" He asked me. I wanted to vomit. I turned my head and didn't reply, trying to pretend like I didn't hear or see him. He stood there for a moment looking at me. It took everything I had not to burst into tears and run out of the store. When I finally paid for everything and went out to load up my car, I saw his van out there in the parking lot. I hurried as fast as I could to get out of there, but as I sat at the light, waiting to head back to the office, he pulled up behind me, clearly visible in my rear-view mirror. When I got to the office, I left my car at the curb and ran inside without the supplies. The travel agency was run by a husband and wife team that I knew really well. The husband had been a teacher of mine when I was a freshman. He asked me where the supplies were, and I brushed him off saying I left them in the car. I would get them later, that I needed to go to the bathroom. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I collected myself after a few minutes and went back out into the office. The husband, we'll call him Alan, asked me if I was okay. I told him I was, but he knew me pretty well and insisted I tell him what was wrong. I gave him a general idea of what was going on without saying too much, and he insisted on unloading my car himself and then driving me home. Over the next year, I found MJ following me at least 8 or 9 different times, and there were a handful of notes left. They were all crazy. One asked me to call him and had his phone number. Another would say how nice I looked that day. The next would accuse me of ruining his life and his friendship with my dad with my lies. Sometimes they would tell me that he knew where I lived and he was going to come visit me soon. It was so absolutely horrifying. I felt like I was constantly crying and scared. I would avoid leaving the house as much as I could. My dad even called the police, but they were never able to find him, telling us that they hadn't been able to track down where he's residing, and that the van wasn't registered to him. Probably wasn't registered at all. It had been at least 3 months since MJ had tried terrorizing me, and I was starting to feel like I could breathe again. I'd started dating a Marine, and then we got engaged. I still hadn't seen or heard from MJ, so I figured he must have left town again. At some point, while I was engaged to the Marine, my dad asked him to go to a bar and shoot some pool with him, so that they could get to know each other. After their night out, the next time my fiancé had me alone, he asked why I hadn't told him about MJ. I was shocked. My dad had told him about my past. I was mortified, but I got over it. My dad had told him how he had been stalking me before we had met, and that the police hadn't been able to track him down, but just that day an old friend had stopped in his shop and told him in passing that MJ was back in town, and where he thought he was working. My dad told my fiancé all of this just in case he needed the information. A few days later, my dad told me he had given the information he had gotten to the police, but that when they went to pick him up, he wasn't there. A few months later, when the Marine and I were still engaged, I was working the office of my dad's shop for him for a few days, and one of my dad's friends came in to get his car worked on. It was a guy I'd never really liked because he always smelled like pot, but I felt obliged to be nice and make small talk with him while he waited for his car to be ready. He was talking to me about my dad. He asked me a few things about myself, asked after my sister and mom, and then asked me if my dad had told me about what happened to their friend MJ. My stomach dropped out, but I tried to be casual and answered no. He then told me that MJ had moved back here from New York and started working at some place I don't remember, but wasn't even there a week before he quit and went to work somewhere else. He only worked there about a month, when he went to lunch one day and just never came back. He told me he never went home either. His girlfriend didn't know where he was, and neither did his parents. They found his van about a week after he left for lunch and never came back, but they had no idea where he'd gone. Not much longer after that, the Marine and I broke up, calling off the wedding. He was hiding a lot of stuff from me and seemed to become more mentally unstable as time went on. He got more and more controlling and started scaring me. I felt like I had dodged a bullet not marrying him. I had my suspicions about what happened to MJ, especially when I started thinking about it a few years later, remembering how pissed my fiancé had been about what my dad had told him, how strong he was, how bad his temper seemed to be. No one ever saw or heard from MJ ever again. It's been over 20 years. I often wonder if I should have thanked my ex-fiancé for removing the nightmare from my life. At least one good thing would have come from that mistake. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to the new, revamped 5 Scary Subscriber Stories. Now what this means in terms of subscriber stories is it's probably going to be a little bit longer in between subscriber videos, but there will be more stories per video when I actually do them. And I think it works out better that way. Massive thanks to everyone who sent their stories to me. I really appreciate that. And I hope you're all happy with the results. Okay, well, it is 6 AM right now, and I just got done recording this video. Wanted to get the audio prep so I could put it together to go up on Saturday. I'm still kind of playing catch up here. So I'm going to head to bed. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.